Chapter 5. Introducing Mr. Giovanelli. As they walked, Daisy told Winterbourne all about her experiences in Rome.
"We have very beautiful rooms at the hotel,"
she said.
"We'll stay here all winter, unless we die of the fever, and in that case we'll stay even longer. I'm enjoying Rome very much. I know lots of charming people here."
She talked like this for some time, then she turned to him and asked,
"Why didn't you come to visit me?"
"I've already told you,"
Winterbourne replied.
"I've only just got off the train."
"You must have stayed on the train a long time after it stopped,"
said Daisy with a little laugh.
"Anyway, you've had time to go and visit Mrs. Walker."
"I know Mrs. Walker from Geneva."
"I know. She told me." "Well, you know me from Vevey. That's just as good. So you ought to have come to visit me."
When they reached the Pincio, Daisy saw Mr. Giovanelli. He was standing by a tree, looking at the women in their carriages. He was a handsome little man, very elegantly dressed, with a flower in his buttonhole.
"Are you going to speak to that man?"
asked Winterbourne.
"Of course,"
said Daisy.
"Then I'm staying with you."
Daisy stopped and looked at him for a moment in silence, but the expression on her face was still serene.
"I don't like the way you say that,"
she said with a smile.
"I never allow gentlemen to tell me what to do."
"I think you've made a mistake,"
Winterbourne replied.
"You should sometimes listen to a gentleman, the right one."
She looked at him again, more seriously this time, with her pretty eyes. Then she laughed and said,
"I do nothing but listen to gentlemen. Is Mr. Giovanelli the right one?"
Just then Giovanelli saw them and walked up to them. He had a brilliant smile and intelligent eyes.
"No, he isn't the right one,"
said Winterbourne. Daisy introduced Giovanelli to Winterbourne, and they walked along, one gentleman on each side of Daisy. Mr. Giovanelli spoke English very well. He made pleasant conversation with Winterbourne and Daisy. He was disappointed that Daisy had not come alone, but he did not show his disappointment.
"He's not a gentleman,"
thought Winterbourne.
"He's a good imitation of one, but a nice girl ought to know the difference."
But was Miss Daisy Miller a nice girl? That was the question. She had no delicacy, and yet she did not seem impatient for Winterbourne to go. She did not seem to want to be alone with her lover. She was a strange combination of audacity and innocence. 15 minutes later, Winterbourne noticed Mrs. Walker sitting in her carriage at the side of the road. She waved to him. He left Miss Miller with Mr. Giovanelli and went to Mrs. Walker, who looked agitated.
"This is terrible,"
said Mrs. Walker.
"That girl mustn't do this kind of thing. She mustn't walk here with you two men. 50 people have noticed her."
"Is it really that important?"
asked Winterbourne.
"She's very innocent."
"She's very crazy,"
cried Mrs. Walker.
"and her mother is an absolute fool. When you left, I thought that since her mother won't warn her, I should, so I came here to find her. Tell her I want to speak to her."
"I don't think it's a good idea,"
said Winterbourne.
"but you can try."
When Winterbourne gave Daisy this message, the young lady walked serenely to Mrs. Walker's carriage with Mr. Giovanelli at her side.
"Mrs. Walker, this is Mr. Giovanelli,"
said Daisy prettily. Mrs. Walker nodded to the Italian, then turned to Daisy and said,
"Will you get in the carriage and drive with me?"
"No, thank you,"
said Daisy,
"I'm perfectly happy as I am."
and she smiled at her two gentlemen.
"You may be perfectly happy, dear child, but it isn't the custom here for a young lady to walk alone with gentlemen."
"Well, it ought to be,"
said Daisy.
"I love walking."
"You should walk with your mother, dear,"
said Mrs. Walker.
"My mother never goes for a walk, and I'm not 5 years old."
"You're old enough to be more reasonable,"
said Mrs. Walker.
You're old enough, my dear Miss Miller, to cause a scandal.
What do you mean?
asked Daisy, smiling intensely.
Come into my carriage and I'll explain it to you.
Mrs. Walker replied. Daisy looked at Giovanelli, then at Winterbourne.
I don't think I want to know what you mean.
She blushed, and Winterbourne thought she was extremely pretty. She looked at Winterbourne and said,
Do you think that, to save my reputation, I should get into the carriage?
Winterbourne blushed a little and hesitated. It seemed so strange to hear her talk that way of her reputation. He wanted to give the reply that was best for Daisy herself. He felt that it was in Daisy's best interest to hear the truth, and the truth, Winterbourne thought, was that she should do what Mrs. Walker had asked her to do. He looked at her exquisite prettiness, and then said very gently,
I think you should get into the carriage.
Daisy gave a violent laugh.
How ridiculous! If this is improper, Mrs. Walker, then I am improper. Goodbye.
Then she turned and walked away with Mr. Giovanelli. Mrs. Walker watched her go with tears in her eyes.
Get in the carriage.
She said to Winterbourne.
I think I should accompany Miss Miller.
If you don't get into this carriage, I'll never speak to you again,
cried Mrs. Walker. Winterbourne said goodbye to Daisy and Giovanelli and got into the carriage.
That wasn't very clever of you,
he said.
I'm not trying to be clever. I'm trying to be honest,
replied Mrs. Walker.
She's causing a great scandal. Italian men come to see her at her hotel late at night, when her mother has already gone to bed.
She's just unsophisticated,
said Winterbourne impatiently.
She has no natural delicacy,
replied Mrs. Walker.
You must stop seeing her. Stop flirting with her. Leave her alone.
I can't do that. I like her very much.
Then you should want to protect her from scandal.
Winterbourne got out of the carriage and said goodbye to Mrs. Walker. He saw Daisy and Giovanelli standing by the wall, looking at the beautiful Villa Borghese. Giovanelli took Daisy's parasol and opened it. He rested the parasol on her shoulder so that both their heads were hidden behind it. Winterbourne hesitated a moment, then he turned and walked away, towards his aunt's house. Chapter 6. Mrs. Walker's Party. Mrs. Walker's party was a few days later. Mrs. Miller came alone. The poor lady was very nervous.
I've never been to a party alone before, especially in this country,
she told Mrs. Walker.
I wanted to bring Randolph or Eugenio, but Daisy told me to go alone. Is your daughter going to favor us with her company?
Asked Mrs. Walker, but Mrs. Miller did not notice her sarcasm.
Well, she's dressed for the party. She got dressed before dinner, but her friend is there, the Italian gentleman. Daisy's playing the piano, and Mr. Giovanelli's singing. He sings splendidly, but I think they'll come soon,
said Mrs. Miller hopefully. Mrs. Walker turned to Winterbourne and said,
This is horrible. Miss Miller is trying to punish me for criticizing her in the Pincio the other day. When she comes, I won't speak to her.
Daisy came after 11 o'clock.
I'm sorry I'm late,
she said to Mrs. Walker with a smile.
Mr. Giovanelli and I were practicing his songs so that he can sing for your guests. He has such a beautiful voice.
Daisy looked very lovely as she said this in her sweet, bright voice.
Is there anyone here I know?
She asked, looking around with interest at the other guests.
I think everyone knows who you are,
said Mrs. Walker coldly. Mr. Giovanelli sang his songs very well, although no one had asked him to do so. Daisy talked as he sang.
I'd love to dance,
she said to Winterbourne.
but these rooms are too small.
I don't want to dance,
Winterbourne replied.
I can't dance.
Of course you can't dance. You're too stiff.
Said Miss Daisy.
I hope you enjoyed your ride in Mrs. Walker's carriage.
No, I didn't enjoy it. I preferred walking with you.
You went with your friend, and I went with mine. That was much better. But really, Mrs. Walker has such strange ideas,
continued Daisy.
How could I get into her carriage and leave poor Mr. Giovanelli?
Mr. Giovanelli was wrong to ask you to walk with him. No young Italian lady walks with gentlemen in the streets.
In the streets?
Cried Daisy.
The Pincio is not the streets. And fortunately, I'm not a young Italian lady. It seems to me they have a miserable time.
People here think you're a flirt,
said Winterbourne seriously.
Of course I am,
said Daisy with a smile.
All nice girls are flirts, but I suppose you'll say that I'm not a nice girl.
You're a very nice girl,
said Winterbourne.
But I want you to flirt with me and nobody else.
Thank you,
replied Daisy.
But I don't want to flirt with you. You're too stiff.
Well, at least stop flirting with Giovanelli. They don't understand that sort of thing here.
I thought they understood nothing else,
said Daisy.
Not in young, unmarried women.
It seems to me much more proper in young, unmarried women than in old, married ones,
cried Daisy.
Well,
said Winterbourne,
you must obey the customs of the place. Flirting is a purely American custom. It doesn't exist here. So when you go out in public with Mr. Giovanelli, and without your mother, people are shocked.
Poor mother,
said Daisy.
You are flirting, but Mr. Giovanelli isn't. He's quite serious.
At least he doesn't tell me what to do,
cried Daisy.
Anyway, I'm not flirting with Mr. Giovanelli. We're good friends, very intimate friends.
Ah,
replied Winterbourne.
It's different if you're in love with each other.
To Winterbourne's surprise, Daisy blushed and stood up angrily.
At least Mr. Giovanelli never says such horrible things,
she cried. Daisy spent the rest of the evening sitting with Mr. Giovanelli in a quiet corner of the room. When she came back to say goodbye to Mrs. Walker, the lady ignored her. Daisy went pale and looked anxiously at her mother. Winterbourne felt very sorry for her.
That was very cruel,
he said to Mrs. Walker after Daisy had left.
I'll never invite her here again,
Mrs. Walker replied. In the weeks that followed, Winterbourne often went to visit Daisy at her hotel. Giovanelli was always there, but Daisy did not seem disturbed by Winterbourne's presence. It seemed that she could talk as happily with one gentleman or two. One Sunday afternoon, Winterbourne went to St. Peter's with his aunt. When he saw Daisy and Giovanelli walking together in the great church, he said to his aunt,
There's Miss Miller.
Mrs. Costello looked at Daisy for a moment, then said,
Is that what makes you so distracted these days?
I'm not distracted,
replied Winterbourne.
You seem very preoccupied. You're thinking of something.
And what do you think I'm thinking of?
Of Miss Miller's intimacy with that ridiculous Italian,
said Mrs. Costello, indicating Giovanelli.
I don't think it's an intimacy in the sense you mean.
Everyone else does. He's very handsome, and she's very vulgar. She thinks he's the most elegant gentleman in the world. He's even better than the courier. The courier probably introduced them, and when they're married, this man will give the courier a lot of money. Yes, I see how it is.
I don't believe she's thinking of marrying him,
said Winterbourne.
And I don't think he hopes to marry her.
She's so vulgar that she probably doesn't think at all,
said Mrs. Costello.
But believe me, very soon she'll tell you that she's engaged.
I don't think so,
Winterbourne replied.
I've asked some questions about him. He's a perfectly respectable little man, but he's not from the best Italian society. He has no money and no title. He's not a count or a marchese, so he knows that he cannot hope to marry her. He probably doesn't realize that Daisy and her mother aren't sophisticated enough to want to catch a count or a marchese.
He thinks he can win her with his handsome face,
said Mrs. Costello.
No,
Replied Winterbourne.
he knows that he has nothing but his handsome face, and he knows that Mr. Miller, in the mysterious land of dollars, will want his daughter to marry someone with more than that.
Some of Mrs. Costello's American friends joined them then, and Winterbourne heard a lot of talk about the scandalous Miss Daisy Miller. He felt sorry for her. He was sorry to hear them talking about her like that. To him she seemed just pretty and unprotected and natural. Chapter